Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer,
And I'm Christa Carmen.
and this is
Murder Coaster.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to our fourth and final episode on the tragic life and mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe. Oh, what a journey it has been these past 3 episodes, watching little orphaned Edgar go from boarding school to the University of Virginia, to the Army and West Point, winning writing contests and finding work as an editor, marrying his young cousin Virginia, settling into Philadelphia and establishing himself as a master of Gothic horror. Then moving to New York and finding fame for writing the most popular poem in the world, The Raven, becoming a bona fide celebrity, while at the same time his wife lay on her deathbed, being slowly consumed by tuberculosis. And it is here in New York where we take back up again and commence our final chapters on the tragic life and mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe.
Let's begin. Chapter 1, 1845. The Best of Times. The year 1845 saw Edgar Allan Poe become one of the most famous authors in America. It was monumental, a defining year for the writer, editor, critic, and poet, a year he'd long be remembered for, a year of his greatest success, followed by his greatest failure.
In January, The Raven was published and was a cultural phenomenon, being printed and read around the world. To his delight, Poe was now recognized on the street. He was a celebrity, dressed in his trademark all black, with his tall forehead and expressive dark eyebrows. And to further cement his look, he decided to shave his long sideburns and instead grow a mustache, a symbol of wisdom, maturity, elegance, refinement, and artistry.
He was 36 years old and would never be so popular again in his lifetime. Poe seized on this popularity, giving readings and lectures, also using the opportunity to take on new feuds. In particular, that fellow Rufus Griswold, who had succeeded him as the editor at Graham's magazine.
Rufus and Poe were natural-born enemies. Rufus was a devout Christian and churchgoer who thought literature should always elevate and have the highest of moral standards, while Poe avoided churches, questioned the very existence of God, and wrote bleak and nihilistic tales of horror, offering no redemption. And Rufus was also a big fan of Henry Longfellow, a poet Edgar openly despised.
A few years back, Griswold had published an anthology of American poets, and had actually included Poe, but only a very small selection, just 3 short poems, while other poets had upwards of 45 of their poems featured. Poe felt slighted and would state, right in the middle of a lecture on poetry,
Rufus Griswold's miserable want of judgment devoted extravagant portions of space in his anthology to his cronies, while giving short shrift to the poets of superior methods.
Thus began a legendary feud that would continue long after Poe's death and shape the legend and tarnish the history and legacy of the man we know today.
And this feud would soon be even further exacerbated. Edgar had become enamored with a Massachusetts poet named Frances Sargent Osgood, known to her friends as Fanny, a name strikingly similar sounding to Poe's foster mother Franny, whose tragic death had haunted him long ago.
Poe had the same poetic bond with Fanny that he had held with Jane Stannard, his friend's mother when he'd been a teenager. A fellow lover of literature, a poet, often sick, with a morbid sense of humor, Poe began to think of her as the only person in the world who truly understood him.
Fanny wrote a poem about him, saying, "Beware his flashing eyes and floating hair." And he wrote her a Valentine's Day poem, where he encrypted the letters of her name into the poem. Which is so, like, the most elementary school crush thing you can do, you know? I made this poem for you. It spells out your name.
It's amazing. So both ahead of the times and behind the times in terms of maturity. Though this relationship obviously held some romantic overtures, Virginia condoned it, even encouraged it. Fanny saying, "Virginia imagined that my influence over him had a restraining and beneficial effect."
It kind of makes you wonder about Poe and Virginia's relationship. He'd say at times that it was more akin to brother and sister than man and wife. But as for Fanny, well, guess who else was smitten with this Massachusetts poet? None other than Rufus Griswold, who did his best to block Poe's amorous advances.
Meanwhile, Poe was offered a new job, assistant editor of a new magazine called the Broadway Journal, and he was soon promoted to co-editor and responsible for contributing a full page of original material for each issue. And he actually made a percentage of sales, 1/3.
But Poe kept on making enemies. He resumed his literary criticism, and he just unleashed on Henry Longfellow, going so far as to say his extreme lack of originality made him an actual plagiarist, and that his poem Midnight Mass for the Dying Year had plagiarized Tennyson's poem The Death of the Old Year, calling it the most barbarous class of literary robbery.
No doubt there was probably some jealousy involved. Poe had scraped and scrabbled for everything, and Longfellow was a child of privilege with an esteemed position at Harvard. As Poe scholar and literature professor James M. Hutchison says,
"All that animosity toward Longfellow is at least partly because he saw in Longfellow what he thought he himself should have been. Longfellow was a well-liked professor at Harvard. He married an heiress. He had a private income. He lived in a comfortable and historic house in Cambridge. It was everything Poe aspired to. We have this image of Poe wanting to haunt cemeteries and gloomy old mansions. He didn't want to live in the house of Usher. He wanted to live in the house of Longfellow."
This period became known as the Longfellow Wars. But oddly enough, Longfellow never even responded to the criticism. He actually liked Poe, thought he was a great writer, said he was, quote, "richly endowed with genius," end quote, and just ignored the incredibly harsh and insightful reviews of his poetry, later saying, quote, "The harshness of his criticisms I have never attributed to anything but the irritation of a sensitive nature."
Yeah, and there is a rule with writers that you are not supposed to respond to criticism or critics. But Longfellow's friends and his fans were pissed. Poet James Russell Lowell insultingly wrote Poe into one of his poems, saying, "There comes Poe with his raven like Barnaby Rudge, 3/5 of him genius and 2/5 fudge."
By June of 1845, this is just 5 months after The Raven was first published, Wiley and Putnam published a collection of 12 of his short stories under the title Tales.
Edgar actually had no say in what stories were chosen, the collection leaving out classics like The Telltale Heart and The Mask of the Red Death. But it did include The Mystery of Marie Roget, which was in some ways a muddled mess as he tried to walk back his assertions of a mysterious naval officer in favor of a botched abortion. And it also included murders in the Rue Morgue and a third tale with his detective, Monsieur Dupin, the Purloined Letter, which Edgar considered the best of his 3 detective stories.
All of Poe's other collections had failed to sell for one reason or another, but Tales took off. Its initial publication sold 1,500 copies at 50 cents apiece, earning Edgar $120.
And critics loved it. Even his rival Rufus Griswold liked it, giving it a great review full of praise. And guess what his favorite story was? The Mystery of Marie Roget. Oh, Rufus.
But many people liked the story. The London Spectator said The Mystery of Marie Roget showed Poe's, quote, great analytical skill in seizing upon the points of circumstantial evidence and connecting them together.
Which, come on, is pure, true crime. Everyone liked hearing the autopsy report and how the crime was deciphered. All that talk of bodies filling with gases and whether they floated or not. The crime scene analysis, the mystery, the murder. They didn't even notice that the killer is never even named and the story walks back on itself and contradicts itself about whether the crime was done by one person or not.
All of which must have been a big relief for Edgar, because he was sweating bullets thinking critics were going to call him out for getting it wrong. He'd been consumed with stress and worry over it all.
And the year was only halfway over. What a year. Poe had grown his iconic mustache that we'd know him by forever. He'd written the most popular poem in the world, The Raven, and become a household name. His books were finally selling and getting great reviews. He had a good job as co-editor of the Broadway Journal with actual stock in the company. What could possibly go wrong?
Chapter 2, 1845. The worst of times.
Edgar Allan Poe always fucked things up. It was a pathological need, and something that he himself was well aware of, and something he wrote about, calling it the imp of the perverse. This desire to just fuck shit up.
I love that story and I love that title, and I've had like a great many conversations about this need with friends. It's just so interesting. And Poe writes of this impulse for destruction and devastation, saying,
The impulse increases to a wish, the wish to a desire, the desire to an uncontrollable longing, and the longing indulged. Say we have a task before us which must be speedily performed. We know that it will be ruinous to make delay. The most important crisis of our life calls, trumpet-tongued, for immediate energy and action. We glow. We are consumed with eagerness to commence the work, with the anticipation of whose glorious result our whole souls are on fire. It shall be undertaken today. And yet, we put it off until tomorrow. And why? There is no answer, except that we feel perverse, using the word with no comprehension of the principle. Tomorrow arrives, and with it a more impatient anxiety to do our duty. But with this very increase of anxiety arrives also a nameless, a positively fearful, because unfathomable craving for delay. This craving gathers strength as the moments fly. The last hour for action is at hand. We tremble with the violence of the conflict within us, of the definite and the indefinite, of the substance with the shadow. But if the contests have proceeded thus far, it is the shadow which prevails. We struggle in vain. The clock strikes and is the knell of our welfare. Alas, it is too late. We stand upon the brink of a precipice. We peer into the abyss. We grow sick and dizzy. Our first impulse is to shrink from the danger. Unaccountably, we remain. By slow degrees, our sickness and dizziness and horror become merged in a cloud of unnameable feeling. By gradations still more imperceptible, this cloud assumes shape, as did the vapor from the bottle out of which rose the genie in the Arabian Nights. But out of this, our cloud upon the precipice's edge, there grows into palpability a shape far more terrible than any genie or any demon of a tale. And yet it is but a thought, although a fearful one, and one which calls the very marrow of our bones with the fierceness of the delight of its horror. It is merely the idea of what would be our sensations during the sweeping fall from such a height. And this fall, this rushing annihilation, for the very reason that it involves that one most ghastly and loathsome of all the most ghastly and loathsome images of death and suffering which have ever presented themselves to our imagination, for this very cause do we now most vividly desire it. There is no passion in nature so demonically impatient as that of him who, shuddering upon the edge of a precipice, thus meditates a plunge. And if we fail in a sudden effort to prostrate ourselves backwards from the abyss, we plunge and are destroyed.
Jim Morrison, legendary lead singer for The Doors and also a huge fan of Poe, would echo the same thoughts over 100 years later, saying,
See myself as an intelligent, sensitive human with the soul of a clown, which forces me to blow it at the most important moments.
And like Jim Morrison, in many ways, the year 1845 had turned Edgar Allan Poe into a rock star. And like a rock star, he partied. Partied hard, was always recovering from a hangover, which made his work habits erratic.
And he grew surly and grumpy. He again became the dreaded Tomahawk Man. But now his accusations were wild and seemingly without merit, truly mean and venomous. And he was just obsessed with Longfellow.
Perhaps it was Longfellow's lack of response that drove Edgar on. He ridiculously even accused Longfellow of stealing from him personally, taking his ideas from the Southern Literary Messenger all those years ago. Accusations his co-editor, Charles Briggs, said were, quote, too absurd for belief.
It appears Edgar's imp of the perverse was causing trouble at the Broadway Journal. As co-editor Charles Briggs wrote to a colleague,
Poe has latterly got into his old habit, and I fear he will injure himself irretrievably.
And then things just got all weird at the magazine. Edgar was saying he was dreadfully unwell and needed to retire to the country for 6 months or longer, and was trying to sell his share in the magazine. And then his co-editor Briggs attempted to buy up all the shares and get complete control of the magazine, found he didn't have enough money. Publication temporarily stopped, which is never good. And the actual owner and publisher, John Biscoe, saw that the end was near and said fuck it. Told Poe he'd sell him the whole shebang for just $50.
Poe went out begging anyone and everyone to loan him $50, even writing to old Rufus Griswold, saying,
Lend me $50, and you shall never have cause to regret it. Can I count on you as a friend?
Rufus unsurprisingly turned him down, but eventually Horace Greeley stepped in to endorse the note and secure funding.
And now, Poe's lifelong dream of having his own magazine was a reality. Yay! He'd been dreaming of this since he started writing poems as a child.
But the magazine was in shambles, and he struggled to both secure funds for the next printing and create content, as well as edit, proofread, do typesetting, and dealing with the stress of holding the magazine together caused him to drink. And being drunk caused him to make mistakes, and it was a downward spiral. He grew paranoid, lashing out, saying,
On the part of one or two persons who are much embittered against me, there is a deliberate attempt now being made to involve me in the ruin by destroying the Broadway Journal. I really believe that I have gone mad, but indeed I have the abundant reason to be so.
And there was the constant stress of his wife, his dear Virginia, who gradually grew sicker and sicker, wasting away with the consumption. Poe writing about his fear and obsession with disease in grisly realism in the story The Facts in the Case of M. Valimar, saying,
The left lung had been for 18 months in semi-osseous or cartilaginous state, and was of course entirely useless. The right lung in its upper portion was also partially, if not thoroughly, ossified, while the lower region was merely a mass of purulent tubercles running one into another. Permanent adhesion to the ribs had taken place. His whole frame absolutely rotted away. Upon the bed before that whole company, there lay a nearly liquid mass of loathsome, detestable putridity. That's some splatterpunk shit right there. Loathsome, detestable putridity. The name of my next band.
Sure to be a hit. By the end of the year 1845, everything was falling apart. The year that had begun so spectacularly was now ruinous. Try as he might, the magazine was beyond salvation. Poe, writing in the final issue,
Unexpected engagements demanding my whole attention and the objects being fulfilled so far as regard myself personally, for which the Broadway Journal was established, I now, as its editor, bid farewell, as cordially to foes as to friends.
Poe wrote to his wife, Virginia,
Keep up your heart. In my last great disappointment, I should have lost my courage. But for you, my little darling wife, you are my greatest, my only stimulus now to battle with this uncongenial, unsatisfactory, and ungrateful life.
Chapter 3, 1846, The Downward Spiral. And so the year 1846 began. Poe drinking more and more, spending his time in seedy taverns. With the magazine gone, out of work, there was nothing stopping him from going on wild benders, drinking for days at a time. Rumors went about that he'd gone insane and had been confined to an asylum.
He got into a fist fight with his old friend, writer Thomas English. A witness to the fight would later write,
Poe was drunk and getting the worst of it, and was forced partly under a sofa, only his face being out. Thomas was punching Poe's face, and at every... This is wild. And at every blow, a ring on his finger cut Poe. But when friends moved forward to intervene, Poe shouted,
Leave him alone! I've got him just where I want him!
Oh, I can't. And so, in these final years of his life, we first see the haggard and bloated, mustached, drunken poet with the sad, forlorn eyes begin to emerge. Thomas English would later write, The bloated face, bloodshot eyes, trembling figure, and attenuated frame showed how rapidly he was sinking into a drunkard's grave, and the driveling smile and meaningless nonsense he constantly uttered showed the approaching wreck of his fine abilities.
Poe and English became bitter enemies. And English actually talked so much trash about Poe that Edgar sued him for libel and won. $325. Big old chunk of change back then. And Edgar celebrated by buying a brand new all-black suit.
The little family, Edgar, Muddy, and Virginia, then moved out to the quiet village of Fordham, in what would now be the Bronx. It was thought being further in the country would help Edgar's health. Perhaps they thought keeping him far from the taverns of the city would quell his drinking.
But Edgar's situation just grew worse and worse, and the Saturday Evening Post even published a call for help, stating,
"It is said that Edgar A. Poe is lying dangerously ill with brain fever, and that his wife is in the last stages of consumption. They are without money and without friends."
Edgar appreciated the call for help from the paper, but denied his friendlessness, writing, "I have been in want of money. It should be folly in me to deny it. But that I am without friends is a gross calumny, which 1,000 noble-hearted men would have good right never to forgive me for permitting to pass unnoticed and undenied."
And as for his illness, he stated,
"I have a great deal to do, and I have made up my mind not to die until it is done."
But for Virginia, there could be no denying she now lay on death's door.
Here's something I don't understand. They had no blankets. How could they have no blankets? I mean, it's like the most basic resource. He just gotten $350 from a libel suit. How can he not buy blankets? But everyone there and historians, they all say that during the terrible winter of 46, Virginia lay on the bed shivering with no blankets and only Edgar's old army overcoat.
She was said to have been, quote, "much suffering and in much pain," end quote, when on January 30th, 1847, just 11 days after Poe's 38th birthday, she succumbed to the wasting disease and died.
She was 24 years old, the same age as Poe's mother and his brother, when they too died of the wasting away disease, tuberculosis.
Poe was devastated, absolutely gutted, saying he was consumed by a sorrow so poignant as to deprive him of all power of thought or action, writing,
"I became insane. I drank. God only knows how often or how much. As a matter of course, my enemies referred the insanity to drink, rather than drink to the insanity."
Chapter 4, Eureka.
Edgar began work on a new book, a metaphysical look at the nature of existence called Eureka, an essay on the material and spiritual universe, telling friends no other scientific event in the history of the world approached an importance to this new book.
Just as Poe's detective stories sought to unravel a mystery using logic, so he sought to understand the world. This may seem obvious today, but was seen as heretical and godless by many at the time, to try to understand the world purely through science and not religion. Poe had no use at all for religion, saying,
"Man is now only more active, not more happy, nor more wise than he was 6,000 years ago. Spirituality? The word is a mere word. No one really has a conception of spirit."
Poe also had no use for politics, saying,
"Most political beliefs are purely personal rather than considerations of principle. The majority of people care hardly more about the characters of their rulers than do the subjects of the Sultan."
Poe saw the world through the eyes of an atheist and free thinker. Eschewing the Bible's creation story and instead perceiving the universe scientifically and mathematically, actually anticipating modern physics from relativity to the Big Bang Theory. Over 100 years later, Albert Einstein himself would say it was a, quote, beautiful achievement of an unusually independent mind.
But in 1846, the world was not ready for this at all. Critics called the book hyperbolic nonsense and a mountainous piece of absurdity. Tales were dismal, and it only served to make him appear a godless heathen.
And that summer, Poe sat for his first photograph, known as the daily daguerreotype.
I love this picture. It's kind of like a Wild West cowboy look to it. Despite the loss of his wife and his decline into alcoholism, Poe still appears healthy and youthful, his hair positively gleaming, his eyes wide and bright. He has what's called the imperial mustache, very small, not even covering his entire upper lip, yet very carefully groomed and curled into upward points.
Poe was going on some legendary benders at this point. At one point, he went into New York City to collect payment for an article he'd written and fell into a 3-day drinking bout with none other than old Rufus Griswold, the two trading subtle insults as they got wasted together. Poe spent the entire sum of his money he collected and ended up detained by the police before eventually being carted back to Muddy to help him recover.
He traveled to Virginia to give a lecture, where he got shit-faced and challenged the editor of the Semi-Weekly Examiner to a duel. The editor, John Daniel, turned him down, refusing his drunken demand to fight to the death. John Daniel was actually a huge fan of Poe's and would write sadly about his alcoholism, saying,
"His taste for drink was simple disease, no source of pleasure or excitement."
And Poe became a playboy of sorts, charming the ladies across the eastern seaboard. He revived his relationship with his childhood sweetheart and former secret fiancée, Sarah Elmira Royster, who is now a wealthy widow. There was also Louis Hsu, who helped him write his poem, The Bells, but she was a devout Christian and churchgoer and was scared off by his atheism, particularly his godless views in Eureka.
There was Jane Locke and Nancy Richman, both married, but both drawn to the morbid poet. Nancy even changing her name to Annie at his suggestion. He'd abandoned his pursuit of Fanny Osgood by this point, but was now flirtatiously corresponding with her sister-in-law, Jane Ermina Locke, also a poet and a widow.
Poe seems drawn to widows, perhaps because he himself was a widower, perhaps because they had all inherited little fortunes. But his flirtatious nature caused him much chagrin and drama, as various women felt spurned. There had been much ado before Virginia's death about amorous letters that Poe had been receiving from the writer Elizabeth Elliot that resulted in death threats from her brother, and Poe was the subject of much gossip and venom.
When Annabel Lee was written, 4 women thought they were the inspiration, and one of them was poet Sarah Helen Whitman.
Chapter 5. Beneath the the Poet's House.
Sarah Helen Power Whitman was born in Providence, Rhode Island on January 19, 1803, exactly 6 years before Edgar Allan Poe. She'd been married to the poet and writer John Winslow Whitman.
John had been co-editor of the Boston Spectator and Ladies' Album, which allowed Sarah to publish some of her own poetry, using the name Helen. But sadly, after just 5 years of marriage, without ever having children, John Whitman died.
The widow, Sarah Whitman, was quite the character. She dressed all in black and wore a small wooden coffin pendant around her neck. She believed she had a heart condition, which may, in fact, just have been extreme anxiety, but was prescribed ether by her doctor. And when she felt an attack of anxiety or depression coming on, she would lay down upon her sofa, huffing an ether-soaked rag.
She was both a transcendentalist and a spiritualist. The transcendentalists, like Thoreau and Emerson, were kind of like old-timey hippies with a deep love of nature and Far Eastern spiritual beliefs. Thoreau famously dropped out of society to live in a small cabin, reading the Bhagavad Gita every day and writing about his experiences in the book Walden.
Poe thought they were privileged goofballs and openly mocked them, calling them frog pondians, which is like one of the greatest insults ever.
And the spiritualists, well, they believed basically in spirits, believing the spirits of the dead can be contacted through various means, in particular through a seance, where a psychic medium opens themselves up to those who have passed beyond the veil of the living and lets the spirit enter into them.
And it's said that Sarah Whitman held seances in her house in Rhode Island every Sunday in an attempt to communicate with the dead.
Poe first saw Sarah Whitman when he was in Rhode Island attending a lecture by his friend, the poet Francis Sargent Osgood. After the lecture, the two were taking a walk through Providence. Remember, Poe loved to take long walks. And as they walked up a steep hill past St. John's Cathedral and its cemetery, they came across Sarah's home.
It was late at this point, midnight, and there in the moonlight, with a tiny coffin dangling from her neck, was poet Sarah Whitman pruning her rose bushes. Poe said nothing, but the image stuck in his mind.
And Sarah was well aware of Edgar Poe and a great admirer of his work. As she would say to a friend,
I can never forget the impressions I felt in reading a story of his for the first time. I experienced a sensation of such intense horror that I dared neither look at anything he had written nor even utter his name. By degrees, this terror took the character of fascination. I devoured with a half-reluctant and fearful avidity every line that fell from his pen.
A few years later, a Manhattan saloon hostess, Anne Lynch, asked Sarah to send her some poems for her Valentine's Day party. And Sarah sent a Valentine poem addressed to Edgar Poe, waxing on gothically about his writing, in particular, The Raven. And if you'd like to hear that entire poem and hear more about Sarah, listen to our Beneath the Poet's House bonus episode and read Christa's book.
Thank you, thank you. And Sarah thought of publishing the poem, but by this time Poe's reputation had suffered terribly. His war with Longfellow and other writers caused him many enemies, as had his drunken antics, not to mention jealousy caused by his many amorous forays.
So Anne Lynch told Sarah not to publish the poem, saying that there were many things, quote, very abominable about Poe. She also said,
I would like to have published the poem, but he is in such bad odor with most persons who visit me, that if I were to receive him, I should lose the company of many whom I value more. I would not pursue having it published, not because it is not beautiful in itself, but there is a deeply rooted prejudice against him.
Undeterred, Sarah still submitted the poem to journals, and it was published in the March 18th edition of Home Journal. The piece caught the attention of Fanny Osgood, who'd long had a semi-romantic relationship with Poe, and Fanny wrote to Whitman about him, saying ambiguously,
I see by the Home Journal that your beautiful invocation has reached the Raven. May Providence protect you, for his croak the most eloquent imaginable. He is in truth a glorious devil with large heart and brain.
And Edgar responded to the poem by writing one of his own, saying to Sarah, I saw thee once only, years ago. I must not say how many, but not many. It was a July midnight, and from out the full-orbed moon, that like thine own soul soaring, I saw thee half reclining, while the moon fell on upturned faces of the roses, and on thine own upturned, alas, in sorrow. Was it not fate that on this July midnight, was it not fate whose name is also sorrow, that bade me pause before that garden gate, to breathe the incense of those slumbering roses?
And on September 21st, Edgar Poe showed up on the doorstep of Sarah Whitman's home with a bound book of his poems and stories, inscribed,
To Mrs. Sarah Helen Whitman, from the most devoted of her friends, Edgar Poe.
The two visited the Athenaeum Library, where she asked him if he'd read a poem she'd come across written by an anonymous author. A poem she cared very much for, called Ulalume.
And Poe told her that, in fact, it was he himself who had been the anonymous author of the poem.
For Whitman, who was a spiritualist, this seemed like a psychic event, too powerful to be a mere coincidence.
And for Poe, who was a Gothic romantic, it appeared Providence. They both dressed the same, entirely in black. They shared the same birthday. They held the same dark fascination with death and melancholy. And how fitting that the author of the oblong box be courting a woman with a coffin pendant.
Poe told Sarah that his relationship with Virginia had been more of a sisterly love, and the marriage had been primarily to see to her care, education, and happiness. Before leaving Rhode Island, Poe impetuously proposed to Sarah, asking for her hand in marriage.
Surprised by the intensity and suddenness of the marriage proposal, Sarah asked for some time to sort out her feelings.
Poe returned to New York, where he commenced to love-bomb the widowed poet, sending her passionate letter after letter, professing his love, recalling their time together, saying,
As your eyes rested appealingly for one brief moment upon mine, I felt for the first time in my life the existence of spiritual influences, altogether out of the reach of reason. I saw that you were Helen, my Helen, the Helen of 1,000 dreams, she whose visionary lips had so often lingered upon my own in divine trance of passion.
Sarah wrote him back that she was worried about her age and health, saying, If younger and in better health, I would live for you and die for you.
And then Poe again just showed up at her door, stopping in Rhode Island on his way to Lowell, Massachusetts for a lecture. And again Poe proposed. And again Sarah said she needed more time before she could give him an answer.
The lecture in Lowell was canceled, and Poe fell into a deep depression. He again began to court Annie Richmond. But Annie, who, remember, was married, told him it would be best if he married Sarah, who was a single widow.
Poe returned to Rhode Island, but he did not contact Sarah. Instead, after what he called a long, hideous night of despair, he went to a pharmacy, purchased 2 ounces of laudanum, then hopped on a train bound for Boston, downing the laudanum and composing a suicide note to Annie along the way.
But he ended up just puking the opium tincture up and never even mailed the letter.
He then yet again returned to Rhode Island and was again rebuffed by Sarah Whitman. And this time, he grew surly and angry, going to the bar to drink and writing to her that the next time they met, it would be as strangers.
The next morning, November 9th, Poe went to the Providence photography studio of Samuel Massery and S.W. Hartshorne and sat for his second daguerreotype. This is the Ultima Thule daguerreotype, a name taken from his poem, Dreamland.
A route obscure and lonely, haunted by ill angels only, where an Eidolon named Night on a black throne reigns upright. I have reached these lands but newly, from an ultimate dim Thule.
This is the most widely seen image of the 3 photographs we know him by. His mustache isn't as groomed as in the first daguerreotype. It's missing the curly cues at the end. He appears a bit wearier, older, his eyes sad, still holding on to a gleam of passion.
And after being photographed, Poe showed back up at Sarah's home in what she called a wild and delirious state, pleading with her to save him from impending doom, saying that she was an angel. Frightened, Sarah had her mother sit with Poe for hours trying to calm him.
When Sarah finally returned, Poe clung to her so desperately that he tore her dress, and a doctor was sent for, who said Poe was suffering from cerebral congestion, the same strange ailment that would be listed on his death certificate just 1 year later.
Poe stayed there in Rhode Island with a friend of the Whitman family, a lawyer named William Pabody, where he slowly recovered.
That December, sober, sharp-eyed, Poe gave a dramatic reading of The Raven and The Bells at the Franklin Lyceum in Providence. It was packed, and Sarah sat front row, enraptured. Poe then read a poem by Edward Pinckney directly to Sarah.
Sarah was so impressed with his performance that she agreed to marry him, and a wedding date of December 25th, 1848 was set.
But there was one strict condition. He must never drink again.
Sarah's mother, who had heard the rumors of his romantic overtures to both Annie Richmond and Elmira, among others, was not pleased with the engagement and drew up a document saying that if the marriage took place, Sarah would be cut out of the will and inherit nothing, which apparently really pissed off Edgar, whose attraction to widows may have been slightly brought on by their inheritances.
Arrangements were made for the wedding to be held at St. John's Episcopal Church with the Reverend Nathan Bourne Crocker, Poe even signing a prenuptial agreement relinquishing claims to Sarah's estate.
But that old imp of perversity was still at work in devilish old Poe. Perhaps to celebrate, perhaps to calm himself after such a dramatic performance, perhaps just because he always had to fuck everything up, Poe apparently went to the tavern and imbibed a few drinks.
Word reached Sarah via an anonymous letter that Edgar had broken his vow to her to never drink. Thrown into emotional turmoil, Sarah flung herself onto her sofa and began huffing her ether-drenched handkerchief.
Which, come on, is so hypocritical. I really can't get over that. Condemning Poe for drinking, but huffing ether? I don't care if a doctor prescribed it or not.
I know you're like so bent out of shape about this. I just like see it as like, I don't know, like somebody today retiring to the room and be like, I'm going to take my Valium and lie down. Again, like total hypocrisy because, but you know.
I mean, I love it. It's so Victorian and stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, it was cool they were giving her ether in Nosferatu.
Yeah. Oh, I totally noticed that scene and was like, that's, very It's just like exactly like you said, it just stuck into my head as soon as I saw it. Like, oh, we were just talking about that. It's funny to see it on the big screen in front of me. Um, yeah, but Poe tried to defend himself, but Sarah refused to see him, and her mother insisted he leave the house. He stormed out, saying their insults were intolerable, and they never saw each other again.
Chapter 6: Hop Frog and Annabel Lee. And it is always at these darkest moments in Poe's life that he makes a Byronic comeback. Despite his bouts of drinking and his laudanum suicide attempt, his heartache at losing what he saw as a soulmate, he continued to write, penning one of my favorite stories, Hop Frog, a tale about a court jester who was constantly humiliated by a cruel king, but had his revenge when he tricks the king and all his cronies into dressing up like orangutans at a party before chaining them to the ceiling and setting them on fire.
Many believe that the story itself was an act of literary revenge on those who had scorned him and spread so many vicious rumors. In particular, Elizabeth Elliot, who said of Poe, quote, "He is intemperate and subject to acts of lunacy."
Scorned by Sarah Whitman, he now devoted his attentions to Elmira, his childhood love, and she seemed open to his advances, saying she'd always loved him. And his work was receiving much praise in France, where he was becoming a literary icon.
And that May, Edgar wrote Annabel Lee, which is often considered his greatest poem.
It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that long ago in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea.
Chapter 7: The Stylus.
Poe had never lost his desire to have his own literary magazine. It was his great dream, and he'd often try to sell the idea to investors, telling a longtime admirer of his work, Edward Howard Norton Patterson, what a unique and truly literary magazine it would be.
Edward was impressed and agreed to finance Poe's literary magazine, The Stylus, a dream come true.
Yay! So Poe headed off to find subscribers to his new magazine and give lectures along the way, telling his dear Muddy that in the event of his death, none other than old Rufus Griswold was to act as his literary executor and supervise the publication of his works. Oh, Poe, bad mistake then.
At some point, he fell into an alcohol bender and perhaps even opium as well.
Yeah, I really suspect he was hitting the laudanum. I don't know. It's my belief.
Hmm. He ended up in Philadelphia, where we opened the story in our first episode, losing his lecture notes, getting picked up for public intoxication, and spending the night in prison. Then stumbling around with one shoe, convinced he had cholera, and telling his friends there was a murder plot against him.
And some historians theorize that the murder plot may have actually been real, not just a paranoid delusion, and that it was Elmira's two brothers who had followed him onto the train with plans of killing him. And he claims this murder plot was over women trouble. Elizabeth Elliot's brother had also threatened to kill him years earlier. But who knows? Just another of the many mysteries of Edgar Allan Poe.
Hitting rock bottom in Philadelphia, his friends put him on a train to Richmond, where things couldn't have gone better. He's always swinging from these incredibly dark low points up to seeming glory somehow.
He was received in the city of his youth as a returning literary hero. A lecture was quickly arranged, the papers stating,
This gentleman, Edgar A. Poe, who is a native of this city, is now in Richmond, about to afford our citizens an intellectual feast in the way of a lecture, and such as we are familiar with the genius of the man can readily imagine will be of high order.
And he reunited with his long-lost sister Rosalie, who'd been adopted by the Mackenzie family when she was an infant, and who'd become an English teacher, and was also an aspiring poet.
Furthermore, he found that his financial backer, Edward Patterson, had actually sent $50 much-needed dollars for traveling expenses. Hopefully he bought some nice shoes.
And it appears that at first he didn't drink, and was at his best behavior and decorum.
He rekindled his relationship with Elmira in person, frequently visiting and courting her. Love was in the air. He asked her to marry him, and she accepted. He wrote to Muddy,
I think she loves me more devotedly than anyone I ever knew, and I cannot help loving her in return.
Things couldn't have been more perfect.
But the imp of the perverse again came calling, and Edgar fell prey to the pool of the drink yet again. He was staying in a room at the Swan Tavern, and apparently the temptation was just too much. He began to drink heavily, getting himself sick, recovering, and again hitting the bottle even harder. And this last bender left him sick as a dog. So sick, in fact, that friends transported him from his room at the tavern to Duncan's lodge, believing his life was in imminent danger, slowly nursing him back to health.
Could these bouts of terrible sickness after heavy drinking been the first serious signs of liver disease? Or was there some other underlying medical condition that was exacerbated by drinking? Could it have been from toxicity, mixing laudanum or some other drug? Unfortunately, we just don't know.
But realizing that alcohol was literally killing him, Poe resolved to, quote, withstand any temptation to drink. And he took the pledge on August 27th and joined the Shockoe Hill Division of the Sons of Temperance. Sober and fresh and back in good health, he gave a lecture to a standing room only crowd in the concert room of the Exchange Hotel to much acclaim. The Daily Republican proclaiming,
The lecture of this talented gentleman was one of the richest intellectual treats we have ever had the good fortune to hear. The clearness and melody of his voice and harmonious accentuation of his words were soul-inspiring. Doesn't that make you wish there was I would love to see a recording, right? Like, how wild would that be?
I was thinking, it's so funny because I was thinking the very same thing. I was like, man, if you could only travel back to see that, it must have been so insane. And the Richmond Whig declared,
We must say that we were never more delighted in our lives.
Poe would write to his dear Muddy, I never was received with so much enthusiasm. The papers have done nothing but praise me before the lecture and since.
Talk of Poe and Elmira's wedding began to make the rounds, though no definitive date was set yet. But despite all the praise of Poe in the papers, Elmira's family disapproved of her courtship with this drunken writer of horror. Her children from her previous marriage would openly mock him and make faces at him when he turned his back. And as we stated before, it was rumored her brothers had set out to actually murder him.
But Elmira and Edgar were truly in love. On September 22nd, Elmira herself wrote to Poe's beloved Muddy, saying,
I am fully prepared to love you, and I do sincerely hope that our spirits may be congenial. I have just spent a very happy evening with your dear Edgar, and I know it will be gratifying to you to know that he is all that you could desire him to be, sober, temperate, moral, and much beloved.
On September 24th, Edgar gave another lecture at the Exchange Hotel's concert room. Elmira was there, as well as Poe's sister Rosalie. A viewer would later write,
Poe had no manuscript, and though he stood like a statue, he held his audience as motionless as himself, fascinated by his voice and expression.
And after the lecture, Poe rushed out into the crowd to his sister Rosalie, who was beaming with pride, exclaiming,
See how the people are staring at the poet and his sister.
Poe himself said it was one of the happiest times of his life, and he began to make plans to head to New York on business, talk with other backers and advertisers as he finalized arrangements for his magazine, The Stylist, which was finally coming to fruition.
He brought his poem, Annabel Lee, to the Southern Literary Messenger, and they gave him $5 for traveling money to New York. Poe telling them he was going to stop in Philadelphia along the way, where he was being paid $100 to edit a volume of poetry.
In his last days in Richmond, photographer William Pratt convinced him to pose for a picture, dragging him into his Doggerin gallery at 145 Main Street. Though Poe originally refused, saying he wasn't dressed for it, Pratt insisted, saying he looked fine.
And this final photograph is how he is often remembered today. A bloated, sad man with a beaten look to him, just weary and downtrodden, much like those last photographs of Elvis or Jack Kerouac, a somber and forlorn look to his eyes. In 2 weeks, he'd be dead.
Elmira would later recount her last moments with him.
He came to my house on the evening of September 26th to take leave of me. He was very sad and complained of being sick. I felt his pulse and found he had considerable fever and did not think it probable he would be able to start in the morning as he anticipated. I felt so wretched about him all of that night that I went up early the next morning to inquire after him when, much to my regret, he had left in the boat for Baltimore.
Chapter 8. A mystery all insoluble. At 4 o'clock in the morning, on December 27th, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe boarded a steamship leaving Richmond, Virginia, and headed for Baltimore, Maryland, where he was supposed to continue onward by train to Philadelphia.
But it appears he didn't continue onward. He stayed in Baltimore. If he did continue onward, he turned right around and came back, for he'd be found 6 days later on October 3rd, dressed in cheap, dirty clothes that were not his own, near Comatose, outside of Gunner's Hall, an Irish tavern being used as a polling place at 44 East Lombard Street. And 2 days later, he would be dead.
Had he been in Baltimore the whole time? If so, why did he stay there? Was it even voluntary? Did he have another fit of paranoia and believe murderers were after him like in Philadelphia? Did he go hiding in foggy taverns in that city perched on the northern end of the Chesapeake Bay? Had he started drinking again? There was a saloon right there on the steamship. Did he strike up a drunken friendship and continue the party onto the streets of Baltimore? Did he start imbibing of opium tincture to medicate for ailments both real and imagined? We don't know. It was as if he was a ghost for those 6 days, an invisible spirit.
His cousin, Nielsen Poe, who lived in Baltimore, stated, "At what time he entered the city, where he spent his time here, or under what circumstances, I have been unable to ascertain."
In Baltimore, he would have disembarked at Spears Wharf, and from there it would have been a short 8-block walk to the train station on President Street, where he should have boarded a train to Philadelphia.
Did he make that walk? Did something happen along the way? He was no stranger to Baltimore, the home of his Revolutionary War hero grandfather, and his muddy, his dear Aunt Clem, the place where his brother had died of consumption and alcoholism.
Baltimore was a wild and unruly place, that strange land that wasn't north and wasn't south, where every few years riots would break out, drunken civilians going after the cops, earning it the nickname Mob Town. Baltimore had a long history of insanity and drunken riots. In 1835, the Bank of Maryland failed, resulting in thousands losing their savings. And Baltimore went wild. They attacked the homes of the bank directors, smashing out their windows, looting, finally setting the houses on fire before they headed to the home of the mayor, who was also involved in this scandal. And he just resigned and fled. The riot went on for 3 days. 12 people were shot and killed. And a volunteer army had to finally shut the drunken madness down.
Political thuggery and corruption were pretty commonplace in Baltimore as well, which leads us to one of the most popular theories about what happened to poor Edgar, that he'd been caught up in cooping.
It was a voting day, and at that time, political gangs would actually kidnap folks, getting them drunk and high, and dragging them from polling station to polling station to repeatedly vote for a certain candidate. Between votes, they were held in rooms they called coops. Thus, this practice became known as cooping.
So many people believe Poe got caught up in one of these, which would explain why he was in someone else's clothes, as often they have voters change clothes to appear different in order to vote as many times as possible. And it would explain why he was in a tavern being used as a polling station.
And could they maybe have fed him laudanum, which he may have been developing a taste for, as well as alcohol, creating a toxic combination, finally causing his liver to fail?
On October 3rd, Edgar Allan Poe was discovered by a printer named Joseph Walker, lying on a plank placed on some wooden barrels outside the tavern Gunner's Hall.
Poe, with a straw hat crammed onto his head, Poe identified himself to the printer and told him he was friends with Dr. Joseph Evans Snodgrass, one of the editors who had published Ligeia in Baltimore's The American Museum. And the printer actually did typesetting for Snodgrass, so he was able to immediately message him, saying,
"There is a gentleman rather worse for the wear at Ryan's 4th Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress. And he says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you he is in need of immediate assistance."
When Snodgrass arrived, Poe was now in the tavern, sitting in an armchair and surrounded by tavern patrons. As Snodgrass would later say,
"He was so utterly stupefied with liquor that I thought it best not to seek recognition or conversation, especially as he was surrounded by a crowd of drinking men actuated by idle curiosity rather than sympathy."
But was Poe really stupefied with liquor? Could it have been laudanum? He had attempted suicide with laudanum before, and he was well acquainted with this stuff. Could it have even been another suicide attempt? Or was it illness? Was it a disease? None of this dispels the cooping theory, rather it works in conjunction with it.
Snodgrass called for a carriage to take him to the hospital, and Poe couldn't even walk the few feet from the tavern to the carriage. He had to be carried like a corpse as he mumbled incoherently.
They took him to the Washington University Hospital of Baltimore on Broadway. We know he was admitted at 5 o'clock that evening and was seen by a young doctor named John Joseph Moran. After that, we know very, very little. We don't really know what kind of care he received. We don't know what room he was in. We don't even know the precise location of his death.
The biggest issue is with Dr. Moran. Like nearly everyone in this story, the doctor had a flair for the dramatic and wished to be a writer, and seized on his time as Poe's doctor, giving lectures and writing about Poe's death.
Over the next 40 years, Dr. Moran would give many, many versions of what happened during Poe's short time in the hospital, each wildly different than the last, each becoming more dramatic and fantastical.
While Poe is believed to have been taken to a private room on the second floor, an area of the hospital reserved for drunks, Dr. Moran insisted he smelled no alcohol on Poe, and that he wasn't behaving intoxicated, just comatose and feverish.
In a letter written shortly after Poe's death, a time when his recollection, in my opinion, is to be most trusted, Dr. Moran states,
When brought to the hospital, he was unconscious. He remained in this condition from 5 o'clock in the afternoon until 3 o'clock the next morning. To this state succeeded tremor of the limbs, and at first a busy but not violent delirium, constant talking and vacant converse with spectral and imaginary objects on the wall. His face was pale, and his whole person drenched in perspiration. I was summoned to his bedside as soon as consciousness supervened, and questioned him in reference to his family, place of residence, relatives, but his answers were incoherent. He told me, however, he had a wife in Richmond, which I have since learned was not the fact, that he did not know when he left that city, or what had become of his trunk of clothing. I told him that I hoped in a few days he would be able to enjoy the society of his friends. At this, he broke out with much energy and said the best thing his best friend could do would be to blow out his brains with a pistol, that when he beheld his degradation, he was ready to sink into the earth.
Dr. Moran said that Poe went into a violent delirium, resisting the efforts of 2 nurses to hold him down, and then grew weak and infirm. The pupils of his eyes began to dilate and contract, meaning death was rapidly approaching. A professor of the theory of medicine came into the room and confirmed that Poe was dying, saying it was from
excessive nervous prostration and loss of nerve power, resulting from exposure affecting the encephalon, a sensitive and delicate membrane of the brain.
Poe then opened his eyes, stared forlornly out the window.
Dr. Moran writes, quote, At this time, a very decided change began to affect him. Having become enfeebled from exertion, he became quiet and seemed to rest for a short time. Then, gently moving his head, he said, Lord, help my poor soul, and expired.
But by 1875, over 25 years later, the doctor claimed Poe had been lucid nearly the entire time, engaging in philosophical conversations, saying that just before he died, he sat up, shouting, "O wretch that I am, when I behold my degradation and ruin, what I have suffered and loss, and the sorrow and misery I have brought upon others, I feel that I could sink through this bed into the lowermost abyss, below, forsaken by God and man, an outcast from society. O God, the terrible strait I am in. Is there no ransom for the deathless spirit?"
Yes, look to your Savior. There is mercy for you and all mankind. God is love, and the gift is free.
He who arts the heavens and upholds the universe has his decrees legibly written upon the frontlets of every human being and upon demons incarnate.
Historians are generally unanimous in their opinion that this was fabricated whole cloth from the doctor's dramatic imagination. Dr. Moran also changes the time of death. At first, it was shortly after 3 a.m., but perhaps wishing to add some spooky melodrama, he later says it was at the very stroke of midnight that the morbid poet perished.
But in all of these remembrances, one thing stayed consistent, that Poe drank water as well as beef tea, which would rule out the theory that Poe had gotten rabies by being scratched by a black cat. A very fun theory. I mean, I love the idea, but there was no sign of an animal bite on Poe, and victims of rabies cannot swallow and have an irrational fear of water.
Another interesting theory that you hear is that Poe had gotten sick from carbon monoxide poisoning from inhaling the coal gas fumes produced by indoor lighting, which was common at that time. You may remember on our 50th episode, we read an actual true case of this from a lady's journal, where the family thought their house was haunted and were hallucinating ghosts.
Proponents of this theory claim that Poe's drooping eye in his last photograph point to carbon monoxide poisoning, and this possibility became so popular that it was actually tested forensically, with Poe's very own hair, locks of which were saved after his death. And Poe would have absolutely loved this post-mortem detective work.
So the hair taken after his death was tested by the Federal Department of Environmental and Toxicological Pathology to determine the levels of arsenic, lead, mercury, nickel, uranium, and vanadium.
The test found no heavy metals had reached a toxic level, seeming to disprove this theory of carbon monoxide poisoning, so we can rule that out.
But interestingly, the tests did show that in the last month of his life, he'd consumed mercury. This was most likely in Philadelphia, when he'd written Muddy telling her that he had cholera.
The test on his hair also revealed that Poe was eating well and had a good diet, eating grains, beans, potatoes, poultry, beef, pork, and that 30% of his diet was seafood, most likely oysters, which were pouring into Richmond, Virginia off of oyster boats. It's amazing how much they can tell about you just from your hair.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. So this disproves malnutrition as well, which has been also pointed to as a cause of death or mitigating factor.
Another theory is that he had a brain tumor, for when his body was exhumed in 1875, so he could be buried in a more fitting spot beneath a memorial, it was noted something appeared to be rattling around in his skull. So fucking Poe. Leading some to postulate it was a calcified brain tumor. But others call this idea preposterous. Who knows?
Poe scholar Mark Dowd Zayac, author of A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe, postulates that it was tuberculosis, the same affliction that took Poe's parents, brother, and wife. He believes Poe carried the disease with him from his time as a child, but hadn't shown any symptoms, which is called latent tuberculosis. And while most fatal cases are of an infection in the lungs, Poe might have had a case where the central nervous system and the membranes of his brain were attacked, which is called tuberculosis meningitis.
And all of this leads to my own personal theory that I have never heard before and I came up with, that he could have had Huntington's disease. Huntington's is a very rare neurological disease where the nerve cells in the brain decay, causing confusion, delusions, stupor, extreme paranoia. Victims of the disease often describe it as a fever of the brain. And the Saturday Evening Post had stated in 1846 that Poe was, quote, dangerously ill with brain fever. Now, listeners may remember we talked all about Huntington's disease extensively in episode 70, The Curious Case of the Two Dr. Gilmers. The symptoms Dr. Gilmer described line up perfectly with Poe's bizarre behavior. Also, it's an inherited disease. And if he inherited it from his father, it would explain his early death and fall into madness, as well as his brother's. Could Poe's constant need to self-medicate have been like Dr. Gilmer's? Remember how Dr. Gilmer had suddenly started drinking heavily when the disease began to grip him? The sugars and calories in the alcohol actually helping with his disease? As Poe himself said, enemies referred the insanity to drink rather than the drink to the insanity. And Dr. Gilmer had felt the constant need to self-medicate with anything he could find, much like Poe's need to consume both mercury, which we saw he did do with the testing of his hair, as well as laudanum. Just listen to episode 70 on Dr. Gilmer, a mysterious and undiagnosed disease causing the impulse for suicide, severe mood swings, paranoia, irrational thoughts, and dementia, leading to an early death from a literal congestion of the brain. Now, I'm no doctor, and I don't know, but I think I may be onto something. What do you think? Did I solve this mystery of mysteries?
I don't know. I don't hate it. I don't hate it. All right, chapter 9, The Poet's Funeral. Poe was quickly buried the day after his death in the Westminster Presbyterian Church. Virginia's cousin, Reverend William Clem, presided over the ceremony, which lasted just 3 minutes, and only 7 people were in attendance.
So sad. The coffin was shoddy, had no handles, no nameplate, no cloth lining, not even a pillow for his head. And in most burials, the coffin itself is put in a box to protect it. But Poe's funeral was so cheap, they just shoveled the earth right onto his casket. As Poe's friend Snodgrass recalled the shabby funeral,
the plainly coffined body was speedily lowered, and then the earth was shoveled directly upon the coffin lid. This was so unusual even in the burials of the poor that I could not help noticing the absence of not only the customary box, as in closure for the coffin itself, but of even the commonest of boards to prevent the direct contact of the decomposing wet earth with it. I shall never forget the emotion of disappointment mingled with disgust and something akin to resentment that thrilled through my whole being as I heard the clods and stones resound from the coffin lid. It seemed as if heartlessness, too often found directing the funeral rites of the poor and forsaken ones of earth, had suddenly become personified into a malign goddess, and that she had ordered those awfully discordant sounds as best befitting her own unearthly mood.
he was buried in an unmarked grave in the back corner of the small cemetery, a spot that was part of the Poe family plot. A headstone was ordered, reading, "Here at last he is happy." But it was destroyed when a freight train went off the rails, which is such a metaphor. For nearly a quarter of a century, Poe's body would lie in this lonely and forlorn, unmarked spot.
Muddy wouldn't hear the news until October 9th, after her dear Eddie had already been buried, and she'd declare, "If it is true, God have mercy on me, for he was the last I had to cling to and love."
And then old Rufus Griswold wrote his infamous obituary, saying few would grieve Poe's death, that he had no friends, that he was a lunatic with a diseased imagination, a beggar, prone to, quote, vulgar fancies and ignoble passions. Griswold was too cowardly to use his own name, so he used the pseudonym Ludwig.
Griswold then wrote a 35-page biography of Edgar for a posthumous 2-volume edition of Poe's work he set to publishing. Poe himself would be to blame for this, as he'd made Griswold his literary executor, that imp of perversion at work even after death.
Griswold filled this biography with scandalous lies. He said Poe had been expelled from the University of Virginia. He hadn't. He'd done very well academically there. Griswold claimed Poe had deserted the army, which he hadn't. Griswold preposterously claimed Poe attempted to seduce his foster father's second wife, and then said he'd made drunken advances on Sarah Helen Whitman so bold and repulsive that they resulted in the police being called, something Sarah herself would loudly refute. Griswold ended this character assassination by saying Poe, quote, exhibited scarcely any virtue in either his life or his writing.
Privately, Griswold would tell people that Edgar and his beloved Muddy had a sexual relationship, a horrifyingly scandalous bit of libel.
The 2-volume edition of Poe's work that Rufus Griswold published sold very well and went through 17 editions, but Griswold refused to share the profits with Muddy, who died penniless in a charity home in Baltimore on February 16th, 1871.
After being vilified by Rufus Griswold, many came to Poe's defense, including Sarah Helen Whitman, who praised both his character and his writing, and would even write a book entitled Poe and His Critics, trying to set the record straight. He was no villain or rapscallion. He was a gentleman, just morbid and sensitive with the soul of a poet.
But the damage had been done, and a dark cloud would tarnish Poe's reputation for years. However, this stormy reputation also cemented Poe's literary fame, made him more intriguing to generation after generation of readers. As literary historian Rob Vallela would say,
Griswold inadvertently elevated Poe's reputation by creating this character.
Poe was already the tortured poet, the man in black, the morbid genius who had penned The Raven, the most popular poem in the world. But now, his bad boy rock star image was written in stone.
26 years after his death, in 1875, a memorial was held and his body was reinterred beneath a beautiful stone monument. Eventually, Virginia and Muddy would be placed beside him, the little happy family complete in death.
I've been there many, many, many times. Oh, Baltimore, the place of my birth.
Did you visit his grave when we were in Baltimore for the Borderlands boot camp?
No, did you guys all do that?
No, I wanted to, and I felt like I heard rumblings.
It's not very far from that. That was
no, that's. Yeah. I thought I heard like whispers of people were either wanting to do that or were planning on doing it, but I didn't. And finally, Chapter 10, A Remembrance.
Edgar Allan Poe was quintessentially American, and the first American to earn his living solely through writing, at a time when most writers were professors or theologians. He was paving the way for the American free spirit writers to follow: Mark Twain, Henry Miller, and especially those wild and crazy beats. He was like a goth Kerouac, always on the move, constantly traveling and writing, exploring the depths of existence with his words. An absolute iconoclast who saw himself as the great American poet. And when he finally made it big, after so many years of struggling, it killed him.
As Kerouac, who managed to live 7 years longer than Poe, dying of liver failure at 47, famously said, with seemingly no intended irony, quote, "I'm Catholic and I can't commit suicide, but I plan to drink myself to death."
Could Poe, too, have been purposely drinking himself to death, leaving Las Vegas style, knowing that it was killing him? Like Ozzy Osbourne would say, wine is fine, but whiskey's quicker. Suicide is slow with liquor. Take a bottle and drown your sorrows, then it floods away tomorrows.
And Poe, like Ozzy, was very much a rock star. From how he held a crowd captivated on stage, lowering the lights in a saloon for a reading of The Raven, the sold-out performances with lines around the block. And like a rock star, he made a lot of people money, but ultimately was used up, exploited, and spit out, broken and bewildered.
Today, Edgar Allan Poe is a cultural icon. His work is constantly quoted. He can be seen everywhere in pop culture. From television shows like South Park and The Simpsons, to goth fashion accessories at Hot Topic in the mall. Hell, Baltimore even named their football team the Raven in honor of him. The colors, black and purple, just as described in the poem.
Besides the obvious influences Edgar Poe had on future writers of horror like H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, and Ray Bradbury, many other writers and poets would cite him as an influence as well, including William Butler Yeats, Franz Kafka, whose stories were very, very Poe-like in both brevity and tone, Rudyard Kipling, Edith Wharton, even Nietzsche, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Vladimir Nabokov.
What a fucking legacy. And so this morbid American poet with such a tragic life, a mysterious death, is now immortal through his words. As Shakespeare, whom Poe loved as a youth, said, "Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this gives life to thee."
Or, as Edgar himself would put it in his story Morella, "I am dying, yet shall I live. Whom in life thou didst abhor, in death thou shalt adore."
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. We hope you enjoyed this series as much as we did producing it. And read Christa's book, Beneath the Poet's House. We will see you next week with more macabre tales of mystery and murder. And please feel free to reach out to us at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com.
Thanks so much.